Working with no return on your work is the worst. So much so, I would imagine, if one's labor is extremely physically intensive, like, say, a fisherman, and like, say you've been up all night fishing and found nothing, and you've thrown the net over and over and over again. And I imagine Peter and his crew, their arms are sore, maybe sorer than mine after shoveling snow all weekend, but I'm not sure about that. So I can sort of imagine my way in to how tired they must be. And so they finally give it up, and they finally pull the boats onto shore, and Peter finally sits down in sand, and he has no fish to sell, so they decide to clean the nets, and he sets to work. And then someone shows up, looks like he has some authority, begins to teach, and Peter thinks, a wandering rabbi? And a couple people filter in, and a couple more, and then it's a crowd of people. And before Peter knows it, he's surrounded. And he's sort of annoyed because he's tired. He's got that headache starting behind his eyes when you don't sleep all night. But he finds himself unwittingly listening. And he's struck by what the man is saying about God. And it seems a little less rule-bound than some of the Pharisees he's heard talk before, and so he can't help listening. And then he realizes that the man is looking at him, and they have this moment where they make eye contact, and he knows that Jesus is going to ask something of him. And so the teacher walks over and he says, could you take the boat out so I could stand in it and kind of see everybody to whom I'm talking? And Peter respects this rabbi enough that he says, yeah, okay. And he motions to his crew with kind of like a, here we go again. Yeah, I know, but let's, okay. So they put the nets in and they take Jesus out. And now Peter has to listen because what else is there to do? He's pretty captivated by what's said. This man seems to really have an authority. There's something different about him. And then it kind of comes to a close, and suddenly the man turns to Peter and says, why don't you throw those nets over the side of the boat again? And this is where I think stories are so great, because how does Peter say what he says next? Peter's kind of a character, so you can imagine it in several ways. Maybe Peter's really annoyed, and so he says, yeah, you know what? Are you a fisherman? We fished all night. No trout. It's not happening. Or is it I'm so tired. We fished all night. We fished all night. Nothing's biting. Or is it that he's figured out something about Jesus, it's a combination of all of it plus some deference. We've really fished all night, but because you say so. And I don't know which it is, but I could imagine it being any and all of them. And so wherever Peter finds himself, I admire the fact that he does what he's asked to do. And despite his kind of disbelief about it, they throw the nets over and, et voila, fish. Fish in mass quantity. And I think maybe the center of the story is how Peter responds. He doesn't immediately start pulling in the fish like the other disciples, because the boat's sinking, so you might expect him to do that. Nor does he say, all right, you're starting tomorrow. Do you want to sign the contract? You seem to be pretty good at this. It's good for all of our pocketbooks. Are you ready to give up the rabbi thing and fish? Nor does he think Jesus is master of the dark arts. Instead, Peter looks at him and he says, whoa, back away from me, Lord, because I'm a sinful man. And he falls to his knees. It's this moment where Peter suddenly finds that the sacred is standing in his boat. And he's so absolutely overwhelmed by it. It doesn't matter that the boat is sinking. It doesn't matter that his neighbors are calling out to him to grab the nets. He just can't do anything other than fall on his knees in the presence of this one he's decided is Lord. And in that moment, something about God is revealed to Peter, but something about himself is revealed too. Get away from me, Lord. There is something holy and divine in the boat. And in that moment, Peter realizes he is not that thing. He is not God. And yeah, of course, Peter always knows that he's not God, but it's real different when God is standing in your boat. You feel it quite keenly. It's rather a stark contrast. And all the best Peter can do is fall to his knees and think about all of his unholiness, all the ways he's been temperamental with his kids, all the frustration he had with his fellow men over the night, all the way he's manipulated and tried to control and said things that weren't kind. All he can think is that this man in the boat sees it all. And he just falls to his knees. And the minute, though, that he tells Jesus, "You've got to get away from me because I'm not worthy of it," is the moment he kind of wishes Jesus would stay. Because this is the most real Peter's ever felt in his life. He knows keenly what he is and what he isn't. And he's never been this close to God. And so he's terrified. But the possibility of God being near him, if it could be like this forever, he longs for it. And Peter is caught between a desperate fear and a desperate desire. It's rippling through the air. And perhaps that's how it always is with an encounter with God. That when the transcendent or the sacred or the holy or Jesus, however you choose to name that, shows up in our boats, it's a moment that tells us something about God, but something deeply about who we are. And not unlike Peter or in our Old Testament passage today from Isaiah, brings us to our knees. Because we all know we're not God, but when God shows up, we know it vividly. And all we can see are the deepest bits of ourselves that miss the mark, the pieces that aren't going so well. And so we just fall to our knees and think, my goodness, I am not holy. And why are you in the boat with me? And the fear can be pretty real. What is God doing here? But then the longing can be real too. Because God is so close. In the thin space, God is so real. And if it were like that always, maybe we could be more than we are. And some of us are like Peter, and that's what the transcendent moment brings to us. A falling to our knees, a realization of who we're not. But I want to step away from the text for a second and say that for some of us, we're not like Peter. We don't have a good job. We don't maybe have a stable income. We don't maybe have kind of our life going okay. Instead, it's the opposite. We've experienced a lot of suffering. The world has beat us down. Maybe we've experienced some violence or some abuse as a child. And so when the holy shows up, we feel completely unworthy for absolutely other reasons. We don't need to fall to our knees because we're too aware of who we are. And in those moments, God shows up differently as the creative force that can breathe new life and regenerate the pieces of us that have been turned to stone by others. Can remind us that shame isn't the final story and that the darkness that shrouds us can be lifted. Whoever we are and however we are, when the sacred stands in our boat, we know something new about ourselves. And we wonder what God knows about us. And it's both full of fear and it's full of longing. And when Peter finds himself in that place, kneeling in a boat, looking at the one he's named Lord, he's expecting something. But Jesus doesn't say, yeah, you're right. Your sin's too much. I'm going to just jump out of the boat and swim back to shore because I can't cope with you right now. Equally, Jesus doesn't say, you're right, and let me shovel some more guilt on top of you to remind you of the other things you've done wrong. And Jesus doesn't mitigate it. Jesus says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Because he knows that what Peter said is true. Peter is kind of a mess. Because who isn't kind of a mess? But he also knows the other truth about Peter, that Peter is God's very own, deeply loved, intrinsically of worth because he's God's creation. And for both reasons, Jesus stands in the boat, and he stays. And more than that, he says, do not be afraid. How about this? How about you give up this and you stay as close to me as you are in this moment? How about we walk together and stop fishing for fish and come fish for some people? Live into the longing and let go of your fear, says Jesus. You can be more than you are right now. You can follow the desires of your heart. Don't be afraid. follow me. And because Peter has looked at Jesus, and because Peter has looked at himself and named both truths, he can leave everything and follow. And that's how this story ends, and all the rest of Peter's story begins. He leaves his own boat. He takes on some new patterns, and he follows Jesus to the very end of his life. Do not be afraid. That's what the sacred always says to us. That's what the Holy One always shows up and says, because there's something innately terrifying about having God show up, because God is so other than us. And what God always says is, do not be afraid. And more than that, God invites us to go with God, to let go of the fear of who we've been or who we might be. Because nothing we've done, nothing we'll do, nothing done to us will cause God to leave our boats. God is with us. That's what incarnation means. And furthermore, God invites us to stay with God forever, to imagine what it would be like to follow closely, to live into the longing for God. That God could make us more than we can ever ask or imagine. We can leave the boat we've always known to find something else. Like Peter, we can grow into wholeness. And when we've looked at the sacred, and we've named the one who's holy, and we've looked at ourselves and we've named the truth, something new can grow. Truth creates freedom. That abundant life our collect today talks about. The burden of sin can be lifted when we know God for who God is, and we know ourselves for who we are. And then, like Peter, we can accept the invitation to leave our fears and follow, to find freedom, and to know that whoever we are, God is always with us, and God is always inviting us to leave what's past to be made more whole. May we, like Peter, leave our nets and follow.